Lately, I have been getting so much support, and my videos have really starting to get some traction, and it's all because of you guys. You are the ones clicking and actually watching the videos, and I am so grateful for it. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing so you don't miss out on any new videos. But only if you really want to, of course. Well, let's get going with tonight's episode. In the gentle fading of daylight, where memory becomes legend and stone holds the weight of centuries, there exists a story carved into the western reaches of an ancient realm. This is the chronicle of House Lannister, a family whose name became inseparable from gold itself, whose crimson banners bearing the golden lion flew above the mightiest fortress in the known world, and whose influence shaped the destiny of kingdoms across thousands of years. Let us drift slowly backward through the corridors of time, traveling at the pace of falling leaves and settling dust, to understand how one house rose from the foundations of myth to command wealth beyond imagination and power that made kings tremble. The Westerlands stretch beneath vast skies, a realm where mountains rise like ancient guardians, and the very earth holds treasures beyond the dreams of common men. Here, where the setting sun paints the hillsides in shades of burnished copper and liquid amber, the landscape itself appears touched by some divine blessing of prosperity. The western coastline meets the sunset sea in dramatic cliffs that plunge hundreds of feet to foaming waters below, their faces worn smooth by millennia of salt spray and howling winds. Sheltered harbors nestle between these dramatic headlands, natural havens where ships have sought refuge since sailors first dared venture upon the waves. Inland from this dramatic coast, the hills roll in gentle undulations that seem to go on forever, covered in sparse grasses that turn the color of old bronze in autumn, creating vistas that shimmer in the slanting light as though dusted with precious metals. The mines that penetrate deep into these western hills follow veins of gold and silver that wind through the darkness like frozen rivers of captured sunlight. For thousands upon thousands of years, since before the keeping of written records, men have descended into these profound depths with picks and torches, bringing forth wealth that would fund the raising of armies, the construction of mighty castles, the forging of crowns, and the purchase of loyalty from lords across territories so vast that a man might ride for months and never reach their border. The wealth of the Westerlands is not merely abundant in the way that rich farmland produces abundant harvests or forests provide abundant timber. It is legendary, mythical, spoken of in distant lands with the same tone of wonder reserved for tales of dragons and ancient magic. Travelers return from the west with stories of rocks that seem to bleed precious metal, of miners who stumble upon nuggets of gold as large as a man's fist, of wealth so immense that it cannot be truly comprehended by those who have never witnessed it firsthand. This wealth became the foundation upon which House Lannister would construct their power, but wealth alone, lying dormant in dark vaults, does not create the kind of enduring influence that shapes the fates of nations. Gold requires vision to direct its use, ruthlessness to protect it from those who would seize it, patience to deploy it at the moments of maximum advantage, and a deep understanding that power is not simply grasped in a single bold action, but instead must be carefully constructed across generations, each building upon the achievements of those who came before, adding new layers to an edifice that grows ever so more imposing with the passing of each generation. In the beginning, in that misty borderland where history dissolves into legend and legend transforms into pure myth, there are stories told of how the Lannisters first came to claim dominion over these golden hills and the mighty fortress that would become synonymous with their name. The most famous of these tales speaks of a figure called Lann the Clever, a man more myth than historical person, who lived in an age so remote that the boundaries between truth and folklore had not yet been drawn, and perhaps did not matter in the way they would come to matter in later, more skeptical times. According to the ancient stories that grandmothers tell to sleepy children, and that singers perform in the halls of castles on long winter evenings, Lann was neither a warrior of legendary strength nor a lord born to power and privilege, but rather a trickster of surpassing cunning who desired above all things to possess the greatest fortress in all the western lands. Casterly Rock, that massive prominence of stone that rises from the earth like a mountain carved by the hands of giants in some forgotten age, was in those distant times held by the Casterlys, a house of the first men who had ruled from its towering heights since time beyond memory or measure. The Casterlys were lords of unquestioned power, dwelling in halls carved from living rock, commanding the loyalty of all the surrounding lands, secure in their position as masters of the West. No army had ever taken their fortress. No siege had ever succeeded in starving them out. No threat had ever made them bow their heads or bend their knees to any other power. The legends preserved across the centuries say that Lann the Clever did not attempt to take Casterly Rock by force of arms, for he commanded no army of loyal soldiers, possessed no siege engines to batter at gates, controlled no fleet to blockade the harbors. Instead, he employed guile and cleverness, qualities that cost nothing in gold but prove sometimes more valuable than entire treasuries. The stories tell of how he infiltrated the castle through secret passages and hidden ways, moving through the darkness like a ghost, creating chaos and confusion among the Casterlys, spreading whispers of curses and hauntings, orchestrating events that seemed supernatural in their precision and timing, manufacturing fear from shadows and rumors, until the proud Casterlys, driven to distraction and terror by threats they could neither see nor fight, abandoned their ancestral seat and fled into the night, leaving behind everything they had built across countless generations. Whether this tale holds any actual truth, whether Lann the Clever existed as a real person, or represents instead a mythological figure invented to explain events lost to history, we cannot know with any certainty across the vast gulf of years that separates those ancient times from our present age. What remains, what matters in the shaping of identity and self-understanding, is that from the very beginning, from the foundation myths that every member of House Lannister learns in childhood, there existed an understanding that power comes in many forms, that strength of arms is only one path to dominance, and that cunning and intelligence might prove equally or even more valuable than the ability to swing a sword or command soldiers in battle formations. The name Lannister became permanently attached to Casterly Rock, and with possession of that fortress came dominion over the richest lands in the entire known world. The family chose as their sigil the Golden Lion, a creature that combines beauty with ferocity, majesty with lethal capability, pride with undeniable power. The lion represented not merely the strength to defeat enemies in battle, but rather a natural right to rule that derives from inherent superiority. The same way that the lion rules over other beasts, not through election or consent, but through the simple fact of being what it is. The colors the Lannisters selected for their banners and their identity were crimson and gold. The deep red of both blood and royalty, the brilliant gold of their inexhaustible wealth, and the precious metal that had become inseparable from their name. Their house words, though sometimes debated in their exact official form, became associated throughout the realm with concepts of pride, the payment of debts, and the settling of accounts. These symbols would carry forward through all the centuries to come, becoming so deeply woven into the fabric of Westerosi culture that one could not think of lions or gold without immediately thinking of Lannisters, and one could not think of Lannisters without those images springing immediately to mind. Casterly Rock itself deserves our contemplation and wonder, for it is more than merely a castle in the conventional sense, more than walls and towers erected by human hands, according to human plans. It is a mountain, a natural fortress of ancient limestone and granite that rises high above the shore where the sunset sea crashes against the western edge of the continent. The rock is so vast, so immense in its scale, that it contains within its depths an entire complex world of halls and chambers and galleries, of mines that descend into darkness and passages that wind through stone, of spaces carved and expanded and refined over thousands of years by generation after generation of masons and miners working to create something that grows ever more magnificent with each passing century. Some levels lie so deep within the rock that they have not been fully explored in living memory, lost in darkness and silence, and forgotten by all but the oldest and most obscure records kept by maesters who specialize in the ancient histories of great houses. The face of Casterly Rock that greets the sunset sea is sheer and imposing, A cliff of stone that rises hundreds of feet straight up from the churning waters below, weathered by salt spray and relentless wind, into a surface that gleams with a pale golden color in the light of dawn and sunset, making the entire mountain appear for those brief periods to be constructed of solid gold, a beacon visible to ships far out at sea, a promise and a warning to all who approach the western shore. The main entrances to the rock, massive gates of iron-bound oak, reinforced with mechanisms perfected over centuries of refinement, are positioned high enough above sea level that no storm surge could ever threaten them, approached by roads that wind up the lower slopes and switchbacks, designed as much for defense as for convenience. Within the mountain, the Lannisters have carved their halls with increasing grandeur as their wealth and ambition grew across the long march of centuries. The Great Hall, the ceremonial heart of Casterly Rock, where lords gather and feasts are held and justice is dispensed, is said to be vast enough to accommodate more than 1,000 guests at once, with golden pillars as thick as ancient trees supporting a ceiling so high that torchlight barely reaches it, even when hundreds of torches burn simultaneously in their iron brackets. Galleries and balconies overlook the main floor from multiple levels, creating layers of architectural space that speak to wealth without limit and ambition without bound. The private chambers of the lords and ladies of House Lannister command the finest views, positioned to catch the best light throughout the day, looking out across the endless expanse of the sea or inland toward the mountains that mark the eastern borders of the Westerlands. Chambers appointed with every comfort and luxury that wealth can purchase and create. Even the mines that burrow deep below the inhabited levels are maintained with such care and attention that they seem less like pits gouged into the earth by desperate labor and more like cathedrals dedicated to industry and the worship of wealth itself. The main shafts are wide and reinforced with massive timbers, lit by continually burning lamps that create an eternal twilight in the depths. Side passages branch off, following veins of ore. Some worked continuously for generations, others abandoned when the gold played out and sealed behind walls of stone. The miners who work these depths are well paid by the standards of their profession, for the Lannisters understand that productive workers require adequate compensation and that skimping on wages invites theft of the precious metals that must pass through many hands on the journey from raw ore to refined ingots locked in vaults. The wealth that has flowed from these mines across the millennia has shaped not merely the fortunes of House Lannister, but the entire realm of Westeros, and indeed the broader world beyond. Gold is power in its most versatile and fungible form, capable of being transformed into anything that gold can buy, which in practice means almost anything. Armies can be hired with gold, mercenary companies that will fight for whoever pays them best. Loyalty can be purchased with gold, the allegiance of lesser lords secured through loans on favorable terms, or gifts that create obligations of gratitude and reciprocity. Alliances can be sealed with gold, marriage contracts negotiated with generous dowries that make unions attractive even when the partners themselves lack personal appeal. Ships can be built with gold, fleets assembled to protect trade or project power across the seas. Castles can be constructed with gold, strongholds raised in strategic locations to dominate territory and overawe rivals. Knowledge can be acquired with gold, maesters and scholars attracted to centers of learning established with generous endowments. Beauty can be created with gold, artists and craftsmen commissioned to produce works that glorify patrons and establish their cultural sophistication. A great house, with rich agricultural lands and strong defensive walls, might command respect from its neighbors and maintain its independence against most threats. A house with legendary warriors and a martial tradition stretching back through the centuries might win glory in battle and establish a reputation for courage and honor. But a house with enough gold to accomplish all of these things and more, to hire armies when needed and send them home when peace returns, to fund construction projects that span decades, to forgive the debts of allies while relentlessly collecting from enemies, to maintain appearances at a level of magnificence that rivals cannot hope to match, to operate simultaneously in every realm of power, from economic to military to cultural to political. Such a house commands something more profound than respect or admiration. It commands a kind of inevitable dominance, a position where opposition seems futile because the resources available to overcome that opposition appear limitless. The Lannisters understood this fundamental truth earlier and more completely than any other family in the realm, and they built their entire approach to power around this understanding. The city of Lannisport grew over many centuries beneath the shadow of Casterly Rock, spreading outward from the natural harbor in an organic tangle of streets and structures that eventually became one of the greatest cities in all the known world. Here, in markets that never truly sleep, merchants from distant lands across the narrow sea come to trade, seeking the gold of the Westerlands and offering in return silks from the east, spices from islands beyond the maps of common knowledge, rare woods that will not grow in Westerosi soil, dyes that create colors impossible to achieve with local plants, and luxuries from every corner of the explored world, and some from places barely known to exist. The harbor of Lannisport can accommodate hundreds of ships simultaneously, with docks and piers extending far out into the protected waters, warehouses lining the waterfront storing goods worth fortunes, customs houses where the Lannisters collect taxes on the endless flow of trade, and shipyards where new vessels are constantly under construction to replace those lost to storms, or time, or the violence of war. The wealth that passes through Lannisport enriches not only the Lannisters themselves, but creates a prosperous domain extending for miles in every direction, a region where craftsmanship flourishes because craftsmen find ready markets for their skills, where arts find generous patronage because wealthy merchants compete to demonstrate their sophistication and taste, where even common laborers earn wages higher than they might in poorer regions because the overall prosperity lifts all levels of society. The streets of Lannisport ring with the sounds of commerce in a dozen different languages, the air thick with the scents of exotic spices and the smoke from countless forges and workshops, the harbor crowded with vessels bearing flags from ports so distant that their names sound like music or poetry to Westerosi ears. For many centuries before the coming of the Targaryens, House Lannister ruled the Westerlands not as lords sworn to some higher authority, but as kings of the Rock, sovereign monarchs answering to no power beyond their own will and the limitations imposed by practical reality. This was the age when Westeros was divided into independent kingdoms, each with its own royal house descended from lines reaching back into the mists of prehistory, each maintaining its own laws and customs and traditions, each jealously guarding its independence and resisting any attempt at domination by neighbors. The Lannisters were kings in their own right during this long epoch, though their kingdom was perhaps smaller in total land area than some others, lacking the vast territories of the north or the populous farmlands of the Reach. What the Kingdom of the Rock lacked in sheer size, it more than compensated for in concentrated wealth and strategic advantages that made it formidable beyond what mere acreage might suggest. The western coast provided access to the sea and the trade that moved along maritime routes. The productive mines generated wealth that could be used to hire soldiers when needed, rather than relying solely on feudal levies that might prove reluctant or unreliable. The natural fortress of Casterly Rock made conquest nearly impossible, providing a secure base that could never be taken even if armies swept across the surrounding countryside. These advantages combined to make the Kings of the Rock powerful players in the complex dance of alliance and conflict that characterized the age of independent kingdoms. During these long centuries as independent monarchs, the Lannisters developed and refined the political philosophy that would serve them through all the ages to come, an approach to power that emphasized certain principles with such consistency that they became fundamental to the house's identity and strategy. The Lannisters understood that while personal courage and adherence to codes of honor might win individual battles and earn the admiration of other warriors, it was careful management of resources, strategic calculation of advantage, patient accumulation of incremental gains, and calculated diplomacy that won the long game of power that played out across generations rather than in single dramatic confrontation. They were not averse to warfare when the situation truly required it, maintaining strong military forces and demonstrating capability on the battlefield to discourage aggression from neighbors who might otherwise be tempted to test their strength. But the Lannisters preferred whenever possible to achieve their goals through wealth, through negotiation backed by the implicit threat of the resources they could deploy, and through the careful application of economic and political pressure, rather than through the uncertain outcomes and unavoidable costs of actual battle. The Lannisters married strategically across these centuries, forging alliances with other houses of the Westerlands to bind the region together under their dominance, and occasionally reaching beyond their borders to arrange marriages with families from the Reach or the Riverlands or other realms, creating networks of obligation and mutual interest that made certain kinds of conflict less likely while opening possibilities for cooperation when opportunities arose. These marriages were understood by all parties involved to be primarily political contracts, rather than romantic unions, designed to strengthen positions, secure vulnerable borders, create paths for potential future inheritance claims, and establish relationships of trust and cooperation between houses that might otherwise view each other with suspicion or hostility. Daughters of House Lannister were valuable assets in this marriage market, their unions carefully arranged to maximum advantage for the house. Sons were educated from early childhood not merely in the arts of warfare and personal combat, but in the subtle skills of governance, in the mysteries of economics and trade, in the delicate and dangerous arts of political negotiation, and the manipulation of incentives and pressures that guide human behavior. The ultimate goal that governed all these arrangements was always continuity, the preservation of what had been built, and the expansion of family power and influence across generations, ensuring that each new lord of Casterly Rock inherited a stronger position than his father had commanded. When the Targaryen dragons came to Westeros, emerging from the smoking mountain of Dragonstone with fire and ambition and a will to conquest, bringing with them the power to burn armies and melt castles that had stood for thousands of years, the lords and kings of the Seven Kingdoms faced a choice that would define the futures of their houses for all the ages to come. Some of them chose immediate resistance, meeting the invaders with defiant armies and ancient strongholds, only to see their forces consumed by dragonfire and their supposedly impregnable fortresses rendered useless against enemies that could attack from the sky with flames hot enough to melt stone. Others chose pragmatic submission after witnessing what happened to those who resisted, recognizing that the old order had ended forever and that survival in this new age of dragons required adaptation to realities that contradicted every assumption about warfare and power that had governed strategy for all the centuries past. King Loren Lannister, who ruled as King of the Rock during those epochal days when the map of Westeros was redrawn by fire and blood, initially joined his strength with that of other kings to resist the Targaryen conquest, marching to war alongside the forces of the Reach in a grand alliance that seemed to offer the best hope of stopping the invaders before they could consolidate their grip on the continent. The two armies met the Targaryens at a place that would be forever after known as the Field of Fire, a battlefield where the combined might of the West and South, tens of thousands of armored men in disciplined formations, faced a much smaller Targaryen force that seemed hopelessly outnumbered by conventional calculation. Victory for the defenders seemed assured by simple mathematics, by the vast numerical advantage they enjoyed, by the experience and courage of their warriors, by every principle of warfare that had governed battles, since men first organized themselves into armies and met to contest territory with sword and spear. But then the dragons came, three great beasts breathing fire across the battlefield, in sweeping passes that turned ordered formations into screaming chaos, and the carefully planned battle dissolved into nightmare and rout. Thousands burned where they stood, their armor turning from protection into ovens that roasted them alive. Thousands more fled in blind terror from an enemy against which courage meant nothing, and shields provided no defense. King Loren survived the inferno through fortune or divine favor. But the lesson of that day was burned into his mind as deeply as the scars were burned into the flesh of survivors. The Age of Dragons had arrived with terrible finality, and the old ways of warfare no longer applied to the new realities of power. Rather than continue futile resistance that could only lead to the complete destruction of his forces, and perhaps the burning of Casterly Rock itself, an outcome that the dragons made entirely possible. Despite the strength of stone, Loren Lannister made the calculation that defined Lannister pragmatism for all later generations. He bent the knee, submitting his kingdom to Targaryen rule, surrendering his crown and transforming his status from independent king to Lord of the Westerlands, under the authority of the new dynasty that would unite the Seven Kingdoms under a single throne. This decision, though it might have seemed like surrender or defeat to more romantic minds committed to ideals of eternal resistance, regardless of cost, proved to be one of the most astute political calculations in the entire history of House Lannister. By submitting relatively early and with apparent graciousness, rather than waiting until conquest forced submission under worse terms, the Lannisters retained their lands intact, their wealth untouched by the confiscations that might have been imposed on more stubborn rebels, and their position as the preeminent house of the western regions, essentially unchanged except for the formal acknowledgement of Targaryen supremacy. Casterly Rock remained firmly in Lannister hands. The mines continued to produce their golden wealth, and while the Lannisters no longer wore crowns or called themselves kings, their actual power and influence arguably grew stronger under the new regime than it had been when they ruled independently in a world of multiple competing kings. The Lannisters became one of the great houses of the United Seven Kingdoms, maintaining all their wealth and using it more effectively than ever to secure positions of power within the new political structure that the Targaryens had created. Where before they had been important only within their own region and immediate neighbors, now they operated on a stage that encompassed the entire continent, with opportunities to influence events and policies that affected everyone from the frozen north to the sun-scorched deserts of Dorne. The Targaryens ruled for nearly 3 centuries, a dynasty of dragon lords whose claim to the Iron Throne rested initially on conquest and the continued fear of the terrible beasts they commanded, and later, after the dragons died out, on tradition and the structures of power they had established during the age when dragonfire enforced their will. During this long period spanning hundreds of years and many generations, House Lannister adapted brilliantly to the new realities of power in a united kingdom, demonstrating the flexibility and political intelligence that had always characterized the house at its best. The Lannisters understood with great clarity that in a realm united under a single crown, influence and advancement came not merely from dominating one's local region, but from proximity to the throne itself, from relationships with the royal family and with the other great houses, from positions within the central government that administered the entire kingdom. Lannisters sought and often obtained positions on the small council, that inner circle of advisors who helped the king govern the realm, positions like Hand of the King or Master of Coin that carried enormous influence over royal policy. They arranged marriages with the Targaryen royal family whenever possible, creating blood ties that bound west to crown and gave the Lannisters claims to relationship with the dynasty that ruled from the Iron Throne. These marriages sometimes produced Lannister queens or Lannister blood flowing in the veins of princes, who might someday rule, creating possibilities for even greater influence in future generations. The wealth of the Westerlands gave House Lannister a unique and powerful advantage in this new political landscape that no other great house could quite match. The Iron Throne, with all the expenses of maintaining a kingdom-wide government and funding wars, and undertaking ambitious construction projects, and supporting a royal court whose magnificence had to exceed that of any subject lord, often found itself in need of loans, requiring infusions of gold to meet immediate obligations when tax revenues fell short or extraordinary expenses arose. The Lannisters became the principal creditors to the crown across most of the Targaryen period, a position that carried subtle but profound power that worked its effects over time in ways that direct military might or feudal obligations could not achieve. A crown that owes vast sums to a particular house must consider that house's interests with special care when making decisions. The debt itself becomes a form of influence, a weight on the scales that tilts policy in directions favorable to the creditor. The Lannisters understood this principle deeply and exploited it consistently, lending generously to the crown, but always with careful documentation and clear terms, ensuring that obligations were never forgotten, even when immediate repayment proved impossible, accumulating claims that could be called in or forgiven as strategic circumstances dictated. Throughout the long Targaryen era, different generations of Lannisters served the realm in various capacities, some distinguishing themselves in particular roles, while others passed through positions leaving little mark on history. Some became renowned warriors, winning glory in the tournaments that provided entertainment and venues for martial display, distinguishing themselves in the occasional wars that arose despite the general peace imposed by Targaryen rule. Others proved to be skilled administrators, serving as hand of the king or master of coin, or in other crucial positions, managing the complex business of governance, with competence that made their tenures remembered favorably in the annals kept by maesters. The house produced beautiful ladies who married into the royal family, or other great houses, women whose grace and intelligence made them valuable political assets, and who sometimes wielded considerable influence through their positions as wives and mothers. Through all these centuries, through all these various individuals playing their different roles, the family maintained its core identity, its pride in the Lannister name, and its sense of destiny as a house meant to shape the kingdom's future. Yet not all was glory and unbroken success across these long centuries. Like any great house existing across many generations, spanning periods of tremendous change and facing countless challenges, both predictable and utterly unexpected, the Lannisters experienced their share of periods marked by weakness, poor leadership, and decline from the highest standards the house had established. There were lords of Casterly Rock who proved less capable than their predecessors, men who squandered resources on foolish ventures or luxuries that provided no lasting value, who made poor judgments in political matters, or who simply lacked the intelligence and will necessary to maintain what earlier generations had built. There were times when the house's reputation suffered damage from scandals or failures, when rivals gained advantage through Lannister mistakes, when the Golden Lion seemed to lose its luster, and other houses whispered that perhaps the Lannisters were not as formidable as they claimed, or as their history suggested they should be. These periods of relative decline serve as important reminders that power is never truly permanent, that each generation must prove itself anew, regardless of inherited advantages, and that legacy alone cannot substitute for current capability and active effort. The nature of hereditary succession in a feudal system creates particular challenges for great houses trying to maintain excellence across the centuries. Power and position pass from parent to child, based on accidents of birth rather than on capability or merit, meaning that a strong and brilliant lord might be succeeded by a weak and foolish one through no fault of the father beyond his inability to control the qualities of his offspring. The Lannisters, like all houses, faced this lottery of succession repeatedly across their long history, sometimes benefiting from good fortune when strong heirs followed strong predecessors, building continuously on accumulated advantages and expanding the family's power to new heights, and other times suffering the reversals of bad fortune when the wheel of succession turned against them and years of careful construction could be damaged or even undone by a single generation's failures. The fundamental wealth of the Westerlands provided a crucial buffer against complete ruin, even during these difficult periods. Even when led by less capable lords, whose judgment proved questionable, and whose management of affairs fell short of the standards set by the greatest Lannister leaders, the underlying economic power of the region continued largely unaffected by whoever happened to hold the title of Lord of Casterly Rock. The mines still produced gold, following veins of ore that cared nothing for the competence of the lords who claimed ownership of them. The taxes still flowed into the vaults of Casterly Rock from the prosperous towns and productive lands of the Westerlands. The merchants of Lannisport still plied their profitable trade, their activities driven by opportunities for gain rather than by the qualities of whoever currently ruled from the rock. This economic foundation meant that even during periods of weak leadership at the very top, House Lannister remained formidable compared to most other houses, able to use wealth to compensate for many shortcomings, hiring capable administrators when the Lord himself proved inadequate to manage complex affairs, maintaining military forces that protected the region and preserved order regardless of who gave the commands or how well those commands. The culture of the Westerlands, shaped by centuries of Lannister dominance and reflecting the values the house promoted and embodied, emphasized certain qualities and attitudes that persisted across generations and became characteristic of the region as a whole. Pride was not merely accepted but actively celebrated as an appropriate attitude for those of superior station, as a natural response to genuine achievement and inherited greatness. The Lannisters believed themselves better than others, not in some vague or unsubstantiated way, but as a demonstrable fact, proven by their wealth, their power, their long history of success, and their position at the very apex of Westerosi society. They expected this belief to be acknowledged by others, and they reacted poorly when that acknowledgement was withheld or when other houses failed to show proper deference to Lannister superiority. This pride, so central to Lannister identity and self-understanding, could sometimes shade into arrogance, creating resentment among other houses who chafed under the constant assumption of Lannister's superiority, and who felt that the Lannisters took their position too much for granted or failed to show appropriate respect to other ancient and honorable families. Yet the pride was not entirely unjustified by objective standards. The wealth was undeniably real, demonstrated in every interaction and visible in every aspect of Lannister life, from their clothes to their castles to their ability to deploy resources that other houses could barely imagine possessing. The power was genuine and had been proven repeatedly across centuries of maintaining dominance despite challenges from rivals who sought to displace them. The long history of success spoke eloquently for itself, a record that few other houses could match in its consistency and achievement across such vast spans of time. Loyalty within the Westerlands, the bonds that connected the lesser houses and landed knights to Casterly Rock, and that supposedly guaranteed their support and service to the Lannisters, was complex in nature and varied greatly depending on specific circumstances and the particular houses involved. The lesser houses of the region owed feudal obligations to Casterly Rock based on ancient oaths and grants of land that created formal bonds of vassalage, and most maintained those bonds with reasonable faithfulness across most periods, fulfilling their duties to provide soldiers when called upon, attending court when summoned, and generally supporting Lannister interests as their sworn obligations require. Yet loyalty based purely on feudal obligation and formal duty is inherently fragile, vulnerable to breaking under sufficient pressure, or when circumstances make the obligations seem too burdensome relative to the benefits received. The Lannisters understood this reality with characteristic clear-eyed assessment and supplemented formal feudal bonds with more tangible incentives that made loyalty profitable and attractive rather than merely obligatory. They were strategically generous to loyal vassals, providing gold when it was needed for repairs or expansions, or to meet unexpected expenses, offering opportunities for advancement and honors that enhanced the prestige of faithful houses, arranging beneficial marriages that improved the positions of allies, and generally demonstrating that service to Casterly Rock brought rewards beyond the minimum rewards required by the feudal law. They remembered faithful service across generations, rewarding not just individuals but families, creating dynasties of loyalty where each generation benefited from the faithful service of their ancestors. But the Lannisters also remembered disloyalty and betrayal with equally perfect clarity, never forgetting houses that had failed them or sought to take advantage of Lannister weakness during difficult periods, and their vengeance when it came could be terrible and comprehensive, designed not merely to punish the specific offense, but to serve as a deterrent to any other houses that might consider similar betrayals in the future. The reputation for ruthlessness that the Lannisters cultivated and maintained served important purposes in this calculus of loyalty and control. When lesser houses considered whether to remain faithful or to break their oaths in search of some perceived advantage, they had to weigh potential gains against the near certainty of eventual Lannister retribution, and the knowledge that Lannister vengeance, while it might not come immediately, would come eventually and would be thorough and devastating. This made the costs of disloyalty seem too high to seriously contemplate for most houses, most of the time, creating a stability in regional politics that benefited everyone by reducing the chaos and violence that plagued regions where lords were weaker or less consistently ruthless in their responses to challenges. The contrast between House Lannister and the other great houses of Westeros illuminates much about the different natures of power and the varying philosophies by which the ruling families approached the challenges of maintaining their positions across generations. The Starks of Winterfell and the vast North emphasized honor above all else. Ancient traditions passed down through thousands of years, personal duty regardless of personal cost, and a kind of stern integrity that won deep loyalty from their vassals. They ruled territories larger than all the other kingdoms combined, but territories that were poor in resources and harsh in climate, commanding devotion through shared hardship and mutual respect rather than through wealth or the promise of material rewards. The Lannisters found such an approach admirable in abstract terms, but fundamentally impractical for purposes of building and maintaining the kind of power they sought, believing that honor without adequate resources to back it up led inevitably to exploitation by those less scrupulous, that noble intentions without goal to support them amounted to little more than beautiful words that accomplished nothing concrete. The Tyrells of Highgarden and the fertile Reach possessed rich agricultural lands that produced abundant harvests and supported a large population. But they lacked the concentrated mineral wealth of the Westerlands, and their power came more from the sheer productivity of their farms and the numbers of soldiers they could field, rather than from precious metals that could be deployed flexibly for any purpose. The Martells of Dorne maintained their independence and identity through geographical isolation in their desert kingdom and through fierce resistance to any attempt at domination, their hot-tempered pride and exotic customs setting them apart from the rest of the realm. The Arians of the Vale held their mountain fastness with ancient pride, protected by the brutal terrain of the Mountains of the Moon and the natural fortress of the Eyrie. The Baratheon seized power through strength of arms in relatively recent times, lacking the truly ancient lineage of houses like Stark and Lannister, but making up for that deficiency with martial prowess and the willingness to take what they wanted through direct action. The Greyjoys of the Iron Islands pursued a philosophy of taking rather than building, of reaving and raiding rather than patient accumulation. Their entire culture built around the concept that true men take what they desire, rather than laboring to create it themselves or trading honestly for it. Each great house represented a different approach to power, a different set of values and strategies, a different answer to the fundamental questions of how to gain and maintain dominance in a competitive world where many families sought the same limited positions at the top of the hierarchy. The Lannisters represented above all else the way of wealth, the deep understanding that gold is the most versatile and adaptable form of power available, capable of being transformed into whatever specific resource any particular situation might require. Whether that be soldiers or ships or political influence or cultural prestige or anything else that money can purchase in a world where almost everything has its price. In the relationships between the great houses, the complex web of alliances and rivalries and mutual suspicions that characterized the politics of the Seven Kingdoms, the Lannisters often found themselves simultaneously resented and courted, disliked, but indispensable. Other lords might mock Lannister pride in their private councils, or whisper about Lannister ruthlessness when they gathered in groups where no Lannister ear. But when those same lords found themselves in need of loans to repair storm-damaged castles, or to fund the dowries necessary to make advantageous marriages, or to hire soldiers to defend against raiders or rebellious vassals, it was to Casterly Rock they inevitably turned. This created a dynamic where the Lannisters occupied a position of being both disdained for their arrogance and their calculating approach to all relationships, and simultaneously recognized as absolutely necessary for the smooth functioning of the realm's political and economic systems. The Lannisters managed this complex position with calculated grace, understanding that they did not require universal love or even widespread personal affection to maintain and expand their power. They recognized that a mixture of respect born from demonstrated capability and fear born from their willingness to use their resources ruthlessly when challenged often proved more reliable and durable than the affection that other houses sought to cultivate through displays of honor or generosity or personal charm. Fear and respect could be maintained through consistent policy and the occasional dramatic demonstration, while love was fickle and could evaporate quickly when circumstances changed or when newer and more appealing alternatives emerged. The architectural legacy of House Lannister extends far beyond Casterly Rock itself to encompass the many structures and buildings they funded, influenced, or directly constructed across the Westerlands, and occasionally in other parts of the realm, where their wealth made its mark on stone and mortar. In Lannisport, centuries of Lannister patronage led to the construction of magnificent guild halls, where the various trades organized themselves and displayed their prosperity. Covered markets with ornate roofs that protected goods and shoppers from the weather, while creating soaring interior spaces decorated with carvings and paintings that rivaled those in royal palaces, and temples to the Seven that featured architecture and decoration of a quality. The streets in the wealthier districts near the harbor featured prosperous merchant houses, built entirely of stone rather than the wood that characterized construction in most cities, making them proof against the fires that periodically devastated urban areas, and ensuring that the wealth invested in these structures would endure across generations rather than vanishing in a single night of flames. The defensive walls of Lannisport were maintained in perfect condition across the centuries, regularly inspected for any signs of weakness or decay, promptly repaired when damage occurred, and periodically updated to incorporate the latest innovations in military architecture as those techniques developed and spread throughout the realm. These walls served the practical purpose of protecting the city from potential attacks, whether from raiders or from rivals or from the chaos of civil conflict. But they also served a symbolic purpose, demonstrating to visitors and residents alike that the Lannisters possessed both the wealth to maintain such expensive fortifications and the organizational capability to manage the complex logistics of continuous upkeep. Throughout the Westerlands beyond Lannisport, the lesser castles and keeps that housed vassal families often showed evidence of Lannister wealth and patronage in the form of gifts of materials or craftsmen, loans for major construction projects extended on generous terms, or in some cases direct funding of improvements that the Lannisters deemed strategically important. A loyal vassal who suffered a devastating fire that destroyed part of his castle might find that a request for help sent to Casterly Rock was met with a generous grant of gold and an offer of skilled masons to oversee the reconstruction, assistance that created bonds of gratitude that extended beyond the immediate recipient to his entire family and future generation. Strategic fortifications along the borders of the Westerlands with neighboring regions received particular attention, as the Lannisters understood, with strategic clarity, that defending their domain required maintaining a network of strong points distributed across the territory, rather than relying solely on the impregnability of Casterly Rock itself. This systematic investment in regional infrastructure served both practical military purposes, creating defense in depth that would slow or stop any invasion, and political purposes, demonstrating the house's commitment to protecting all parts of the Westerlands and binding the lesser houses more tightly to Casterly Rock through tangible demonstrations of Lannister power being used for their benefit. The vassals could see with their own eyes that Lannister wealth was not merely hoarded in vaults, but deployed actively to improve the security and prosperity of the entire region, making loyalty seem not merely a feudal obligation, but a rational choice based on self-interest. The sept at Casterly Rock deserves particular mention and contemplation, for it represents one of the finest examples of religious architecture in the western half of the continent. A space where devotion and beauty combine in ways that inspire awe in even the most cynical observers. Built within the mountain itself, carved from the living rock over decades of patient labor by master craftsmen, whose names have been preserved in the records kept by the faith, the sept features 7 walls of smooth white marble, each wall dedicated to one of the 7 aspects of the deity, worshipped throughout most of Westeros. The ceiling rises in a perfect dome that captures and concentrates natural light, entering through cunningly placed windows, creating effects that seem almost miraculous to those unfamiliar with the principles of architecture and optics that make such wonders possible, filling the space with illumination that appears to have no single source but to emerge from the very air itself. The Lannisters, while not particularly known for deep personal piety or religious devotion, when compared to some other houses that made public displays of faith central to their identities, nevertheless understood the importance of demonstrating proper respect for the faith of the Seven and the substantial value of magnificent religious structures in establishing legitimacy and cultural authority. A house that builds beautiful septs and provides generous donations to the faith earns the gratitude and support of the religious establishment, and that support carries weight with the common people who look to the faith for guidance on many matters, including which lords deserve their loyalty. The investment in religious architecture and patronage thus served multiple purposes simultaneously, providing a space for genuine worship by those who desired it, demonstrating Lannister wealth and taste, and securing political advantages through good relations with an institution that wielded considerable influence throughout the realm. The Gardens of Casterly Rock, though perhaps less famous throughout the realm than the legendary gardens at Highgarden, represent another aspect of Lannister taste, ambition, and willingness to invest enormous resources in projects designed primarily to display wealth and cultural sophistication, rather than to serve immediate practical purposes. Built on terraces carved into the rock face on the inland side of the mountain, these gardens descend in carefully planned levels, each terrace featuring different plantings selected for their beauty and symbolic significance, with water features that include fountains, pools, and artificial streams that create sounds of flowing water throughout the garden spaces. The uppermost gardens, which catch the morning sun and remain in light for most of the day, feature flowers and plants that thrive in bright conditions and highlight intensity, creating brilliant displays of color that can be seen from great distances. The middle terraces provide more shade and cooler temperatures as one descends, making them suitable for different species that prefer less intense sunlight, and the plantings there emphasize foliage and texture rather than flowers. The lowest gardens, closest to the ground level and the city below, incorporate salt-tolerant species that can withstand the spray carried on ocean winds, and these gardens offer spectacular views out across Lannisport to the Sunset Sea beyond, making them favored spots for private conversations and romantic encounters. The entire garden complex represents decades of continuous labor and enormous expense, requiring constant maintenance by teams of skilled gardeners who understand the needs of the hundreds of different plant species represented in the collection. But this expense is justified in Lannister eyes by the beauty and prestige such gardens confer on the house. When important visitors come to Casterly Rock, they are inevitably given tours of the gardens, and they leave with impressions of a house whose wealth extends even to creating elaborate outdoor spaces purely for aesthetic enjoyment, a luxury that most houses cannot begin to afford, and that sets the Lannisters apart as operating at a level of magnificence beyond ordinary noble families. The libraries of Casterly Rock House collections, gathered over many centuries, containing not merely books and manuscripts, but also scrolls from ancient times, maps showing territories both familiar and exotic, ledgers recording centuries of transactions and accounts, and documents that preserve the accumulated knowledge and records of everything the house has learned and experienced across its long history. These are not collections meant for public access or scholarly research in the manner of the great libraries at the Citadel or at certain universities in the Free Cities, but rather private archives that serve the interests and needs of House Lannister exclusively. The financial records alone fill entire rooms, shelf after shelf of carefully maintained accounts documenting every significant transaction, every loan extended and repaid or defaulted, every debt owed to the Lannisters or owed by them to others, stretching back for generations and creating an institutional memory of obligations and relationships that no individual could possibly retain in personal recollection. These financial records serve as powerful tools of power, allowing the Lannisters to remind debtors of their obligations with perfect accuracy, to track the long-term financial relationships between houses, and to provide the detailed information necessary for making complex financial and political calculations that might depend on understanding patterns visible only when data from many years can be examined and analyzed. When a Lannister maester can produce records proving that a particular house has owed money to Casterly Rock for 3 generations, and that the debt has grown through accumulated interest to a sum far larger than the original loan, that documentation transforms a vague obligation into a specific claim that cannot be easily dismissed or denied. The training yards of Casterly Rock, where young men of House Lannister and their bannermen spend years practicing with sword and lance, and bow under the demanding tutelage of masters-at-arms, who maintain the highest standards and accept nothing less than excellence from their students, produce some of the finest warriors in the realm despite the house's reputation for valuing gold above glory. The Lannisters understand with perfect clarity that wealth alone cannot protect their position or ensure their security in a world where personal combat skill and military capability remain important, even in an age where gold can hire armies. A lord must be able to command respect in the training yard and on the battlefield, as well as in the counting house and the council chamber, must be able to demonstrate personal courage and martial skill, even if he never intends to fight except when absolutely necessary. Lannister heirs receive comprehensive education in all martial skills from early childhood, beginning with basic swordwork and riding almost as soon as they can walk, progressing through increasingly sophisticated techniques as they grow, and eventually mastering the full range of weapons and tactics expected of knights and noble warriors. The goal is not necessarily to make every Lannister heir the finest fighter in the realm, which would be unrealistic given that martial genius is rare and cannot be taught to those who lack natural talent, but rather to ensure that every Lannister can acquit himself respectably in personal combat, and that the house as a whole maintains enough genuinely skilled warriors to uphold its military reputation. The Lannister fleet, maintained at considerable expense in the harbors of Lannisport, represents another dimension of the house's comprehensive approach to power, providing capability to project force along the western coast and to protect the vital maritime trade that flows through Lannisport and enriches the entire region. While not as large or as formidable as the royal fleet when the crown chose to maintain one at full strength, nor as numerous as the naval forces commanded by the seafaring houses of the Iron Islands, the Lannister warships and merchant vessels combined give the house significant ability to influence events at sea, and to ensure that the Sunset Sea remained open to Lannister trade while being potentially closed to Lannister enemy. The fleet is maintained in excellent condition through regular maintenance and periodic replacement of vessels that become too old or damaged to serve effectively, a visible symbol of wealth and power that greets every ship entering Lannisport harbor. The red and gold banners flying from the masts of dozens of vessels serve as constant reminders that these waters belong to the Lion, that anyone who wishes to trade here or travel these coasts must do so with Lannister permission, or at least with Lannister tolerance. The presence of this fleet, even when it never actually engages in combat, influences the calculations of potential enemies and provides security for the merchant vessels that generate so much of the wealth flowing into Lannister coffers. As the long centuries of Targaryen rule proceeded, as the dynasty that had united the Seven Kingdoms through conquest slowly showed signs of decline and internal weakness, the Lannisters observed these developments with their characteristic careful attention and strategic calculation. The dragons that had made Targaryen conquest possible and Targaryen rule unchallengeable died out, the last of those terrible and magnificent creatures perishing in circumstances that remain somewhat mysterious and debated among those who study such history. Without dragons, the Targaryens became merely another royal house, distinguished by their distinctive appearance and their claim to rule based on historical conquest, rather than by any overwhelming force that made resistance futile. The realm experienced increasing periods of instability as the Targaryen line weakened through inbreeding, madness, and the inevitable decay that affects dynasties as they age and stagnate. Civil wars between rival Targaryen claimants to the throne erupted periodically, tearing the realm apart and forcing all the great houses to choose sides in conflicts where the stakes were enormous and the outcomes uncertain. Growing questions emerged about whether the Targaryen dynasty still possessed the fitness to rule, whether their claim based on ancient conquest remained valid when the power that achieved that conquest no longer existed, whether the time had come for new arrangements that might better serve the realm's needs. The Lannisters navigated these dangerous times with characteristic care and calculation, choosing sides in these conflicts when necessary but never committing so completely that failure of their chosen faction would mean ruin for House Lannister. They understood that in times of chaos and civil war, the houses that survived and emerged strengthened were often those that committed their resources carefully rather than throwing everything into desperate gambles, that preserved flexibility to change course if circumstances shifted, that maintained enough strength in reserve to matter regardless of which faction ultimately prevail. When the Targaryen reign finally ended in rebellion and blood, when the dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries collapsed under the weight of its own dysfunction, and the fury of houses that had suffered under the rule of the Mad King, House Lannister played a role that would be debated, analyzed, and condemned by some, while praised by others for generations to come. The rebellion was led by Robert Baratheon, with crucial support from the Starks of Winterfell and the Arryns of the Vale, great houses that had their own grievances against the crown and their own reasons for wanting to see the Targaryen dynasty ended forever. For most of the conflict, while battles raged and men died and the outcome remained uncertain, Tywin Lannister, who had by this time become Lord of Casterly Rock and had established himself as one of the most formidable political minds in all the realm, remained neutral. This neutrality was itself a significant choice, a calculated decision that denied the Targaryen crown the strength of the Westerlands, while avoiding commitment to the rebel side that might have proven disastrous if the rebellion had ultimately failed. Tywin watched and waited while others bled and died, assessing which side seemed more likely to prevail, calculating the optimal moment to commit Lannister strength in a way that would maximize credit for the victory while minimizing the risks and costs of participation. Only near the very end, when the rebellion's success seemed assured by Robert Baratheon's victory at the Trident and the death of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, when the balance had tipped decisively against the crown and King's Landing lay vulnerable, did Tywin march with his armies. The Lannister forces came to the gates of the capital city, claiming to support the Targaryens, presenting themselves as loyal vassals coming to the defense of their king. The Mad King Aerys Targaryen, desperate for any aid as his enemies closed in, ordered the gates open to admit what he believed were his allies, his loyal Lannisters coming at last to save him and his dynasty from the rebels who sought to pull them down. What followed was not rescue, but betrayal and sack. The Lannister forces, once inside the walls, turned on the city they had claimed to defend. The capital was taken with violence and chaos, the Lannister soldiers given freedom to plunder that they exercised enthusiastically. The royal family met terrible fates in the confusion and violence of those desperate hours, their end ensuring that the Targaryen dynasty could not be restored, even if someone later wished to make the attempt. When the rebel army, with Ned Stark as their commander, finally entered the city to claim the throne and the crown, he found that the Lannisters had already done much of the crucial work of ending the old regime, though by methods that more honorable men found distasteful and that raised questions about Lannister character and trustworthiness. This sequence of events exemplifies the Lannister approach to power at its most ruthless and pragmatically calculating. They waited, watching while others bled and died in the uncertain early phases of the conflict. They chose the winning side only when victory became highly probable, minimizing their risk while maximizing their ability to claim credit for the crucial final outcome. They achieved their goals through methods that others might find dishonorable, but that proved highly effective in advancing Lannister interests. Other houses might find such calculated treachery distasteful, viewing it as lacking in the honor and courage that should characterize the actions of great lords. But the Lannisters would respond that their approach was simply realistic, that honor is a luxury that can be afforded only by those secure enough in their power, that they need not to worry about the very survival of their house, and that the first duty of any great house is to its own survival and advancement rather than that to some abstract principles that might lead to noble defeat. The new king, Robert Baratheon, found himself owing much to Lannister support in that crucial final stage of the rebellion. even though the Lannisters had avoided the risks and costs that Robert and his allies had borne throughout most of the conflict. This debt, this sense of obligation, however reluctant or resentful, was formalized and given permanent form through a marriage alliance as Robert wed Cersei Lannister, daughter of Tywin and acknowledged as one of the most beautiful women in the entire realm. This marriage united the new Baratheon dynasty with the wealthiest and most powerful house in the kingdom, creating a political relationship that would define the next era of Westerosi politics and give the Lannisters influence at the very center of power that exceeded even what they had enjoyed during the Targaryen years. The Lannisters had achieved through this marriage and the events surrounding it what they had sought for many generations. Direct connection to the Iron Throne itself, the opportunity to shape royal policy from within the royal family, rather than merely seeking to influence it from outside. A position where Lannister interests and the interests of the crown could be made to align so closely they became effectively identical. The Golden Lions had reached the very summit of power in the realm, limited only by the need to maintain some pretense that the king, rather than his wife's family, actually ruled. Tywin Lannister stands as perhaps the most significant and consequential figure in the entire long history of House Lannister, a lord whose personal impact reshaped not merely his own family, but the political landscape of the entire realm for generations. Born to a father who had allowed the house's reputation to decline through weakness, indecisiveness, and poor judgment, who had let vassals and rivals mock the Lannisters without consequence, and who had squandered resources on mistresses and unworthy favorites, Tywin inherited a position that required restoration and redemption rather than mere maintenance. He set about this task of rebuilding the family's reputation with methodical ruthlessness that would become his trademark, understanding that respect lost through weakness could be regained only through dramatic demonstrations, that the new Lord of Casterly Rock would tolerate no disrespect or challenge to his authority. His father, Lord Tywin Lannister, had been a gentle and kind man, qualities that might be virtues in a merchant or a septon, but that proved disastrous in a great lord. Tywin lent gold freely without ensuring repayment, forgave debts when debtors claimed hardship, and sought to be loved rather than feared or respected. He took a low-born woman as his mistress and allowed her to wear his late wife's jewelry and gowns, a humiliation that his children had to witness. Most damagingly, he allowed his vassals to see his weakness and to exploit it without consequence. Two houses in particular, House Rain of Castamere and House Tarbeck of Tarbeck Hall, had grown bold during Titus's weakness. The Rains were wealthy and powerful, ruling from Castamere, a castle partially built underground into the mines that had made them rich, second only to the Lannisters themselves in the wealth they could command. The Tarbecks were less wealthy, but equally proud, and even more reckless in their ambitions. Both houses had borrowed heavily from Casterly Rock during Titus's tenure, and both had grown increasingly contemptuous of their overlord when he failed to press them for repayment or to respond to their various slights and insults. Lord Rain wore fine clothes copied from Lannister fashions and spoke of himself as if he were an independent lord rather than a vassal. Lady Tarbeck, who had been born Ellen Rain and whose pride exceeded even that of her birth family, responded to Titus's gentle request for repayment by seizing 3 Lannisters who had come on official business and holding them hostage. When Titus responded with worry rather than fury, when he sent negotiators rather than soldiers, the contempt of these houses grew even greater. They began to speak openly of replacing House Lannister as the preeminent power in the Westerlands, suggesting that the wealth and strength of Casterly Rock might be better managed by those with the will to use them properly. Young Tywin, serving as his father's heir and watching this humiliation unfold, understood that something fundamental had broken in the relationship between Casterly Rock and its vassals. Fear and respect had been replaced by contempt and mockery. The reputation of House Lannister, built over thousands of years, was being destroyed by a single generation's weakness. When Titus made Tywin his heir apparent and gave him authority to act, Tywin secured his father's permission to deal with the situation in the Westerlands, decisively. What followed would be remembered forever after, as the definitive demonstration of what happened to those who mistook Lannister forbearance for Lannister weakness. Tywin's response to the Tarbeck seizure of Lannister men was not negotiation, but immediate military action. He gathered forces and marched on Tarbeck Hall, but before he could arrive, Lord Tarbeck led his own forces out to meet what he assumed would be a token force meant to intimidate rather than destroy. The battle was brief and one-sided. Lord Tarbeck died in the fighting, his forces were scattered, and Tywin's army descended on Tarbeck Hall itself. Lady Tarbeck, receiving word of her husband's death and seeing the Lannister forces approaching, made the fatal decision to resist rather than surrender. She believed that the strength of her walls and the support of House Rain would save her. She was wrong on both counts. Tywin's forces took Tarbeck Hall in a single day of assault. Lady Tarbeck died in the fighting, though accounts differ on whether she was killed by soldiers or took her own life rather than face capture. Every member of House Tarbeck, from the elderly to infants, was put to death. The castle was pulled down stone by stone until nothing remained but ruins. The Tarbeck lands were seized and distributed to more loyal houses. But Tywin was not finished, for he understood that House Rain had been behind the Tarbeck defiance, encouraging it and promising support. Lord Roger Rain, called the Red Lion of Castamere, had assumed that Tywin would accept some negotiated settlement now that the Tarbecks had been dealt with, that the young Lannister lord would be satisfied with that demonstration and would not dare to move against a house as powerful and wealthy as the Rains. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. When Tywin's armies marched on Castamere, Lord Rain initially led his own forces out to meet them, confident in his strength and in his reputation as a warrior. But when he saw the size of the host that Tywin had assembled, when he understood that this was not a punitive expedition, but a war of extermination, he retreated back to Castamere and barred the gates, believing that his fortress, with its deep mines and underground chambers, could withstand any siege. The castle had been built partially into the mines that had enriched House Rain, with entire sections carved into the living rock beneath the hills. It was well supplied and seemingly impregnable to conventional assault. Tywin did not attempt a conventional assault or siege. He did not waste his men's lives against strong walls or wait for starvation to force surrender. Instead, he ordered his men to redirect a stream that flowed near Castamere, channeling the water into the mines beneath the castle. As the water began to flood the underground passages and chambers, as it became clear what Tywin intended, Lord Rain sent desperate messages offering surrender, offering to pay any amount demanded, offering hostages and oaths, and anything else that might spare his house. Tywin's response was silence. The water continued to flow into the mines, rising steadily, flooding chamber after chamber as those trapped inside retreated to higher levels. The fortress that had seemed so strong became a trap. Its underground passages transformed into death chambers as the water rose inexorably higher. Some attempted to flee through the upper levels only to find Lannister soldiers waiting to cut them down. Others drowned in the flooded passages below. Lord Rain, his family, his household, his servants, his soldiers, everyone who had taken shelter in Castamere, died that day, either by drowning or by the sword. When the killing was done, when the water had been allowed to drain and the bodies had been pulled from the flooded passages, Tywin ordered Castamere itself destroyed. The castle was pulled down, its walls broken, its towers toppled. The mines were sealed. The Rain lands were confiscated and distributed to loyal houses. Every member of House Rain was dead, and Tywin ordered that the name itself be forbidden, that no one should speak of the Rains except as a warning of what happened to those who defied House Lannister. A bard composed a song about the destruction of House Rain, a song that became known as the Rains of Castamere, playing on the words rains and rains. The song told of the proud lord in his hall beneath the hills, and of how the rains came down and drowned him and all his pride. But everyone who heard the song understood that these were not natural rains, but water deliberately channeled by Tywin Lannister, and that the song was less a lament than a warning. When the Rains of Castamere was played at feasts or gatherings, it served as a reminder of Lannister power and Lannister ruthlessness, of what happened to houses that forgot their place or challenged their overlords. The destruction of houses Rain and Tarbeck achieved exactly what Tywin intended. No vassal house in the Westerlands would dare show disrespect or disloyalty after witnessing what happened to those who had done so. Other great houses throughout the realm revised their estimates of Lannister power and resolve upward, understanding that the new Lord of Casterly Rock combined the traditional wealth of his house with a personal will of iron and a complete willingness to use extreme violence to protect his interests and punish his enemies. The reputation of House Lannister was not merely restored, but enhanced beyond what it had been even before his father's weakness had damaged it. The methods Tywin employed were brutal beyond what many considered necessary or appropriate. Some lords whispered that he had gone too far, that destroying entire houses, including women and children, exceeded the bounds of acceptable conduct, even in punishing rebellion. But Tywin would have responded that half measures would have left the problem unsolved, that showing mercy to rebels merely encouraged future rebellions, and that the temporary brutality of complete destruction prevented the ongoing violence and instability that would have resulted from inadequate response. Whether one agreed with his methods or recoiled from them, no one could deny their effectiveness. Tywin's action sent shockwaves throughout the realm and established once and for all that the time of weakness had ended, and that House Lannister had returned to the kind of ruthless strength that had always characterized the family at its most formidable. This demonstration of overwhelming ruthlessness sent a message that echoed throughout the realm and that no one could possibly misunderstand. Tywin Lannister would not tolerate any challenge to his authority, and those who tested him would face destruction so complete that their very names would be forgotten. These actions, while brutal beyond what many considered necessary or appropriate, achieved exactly what Tywin intended. No vassal house in the Westerlands would dare show disrespect or disloyalty after witnessing what happened to those who had done so. Other great houses throughout the realm revised their estimates of Lannister power and resolve upward, understanding that the new Lord of Casterly Rock combined the traditional wealth of his house with a personal will of iron and a complete willingness to use extreme violence to protect his interests and punish his enemies. As Hand of the King to Aerys Targaryen for 20 years, serving in the highest appointed office in the realm and effectively governing the Seven Kingdoms during his long tenure, Tywin demonstrated that Lannister resources combined with Lannister intelligence and administrative capability could dominate the political landscape not merely of the Westerlands, but of the entire continent. He managed the kingdom's finances with exceptional competence, bringing order to accounts that had grown chaotic under previous administrators, implementing systems for tax collection and expenditure tracking that increased revenues while reducing waste and corruption. He led the realm's armies in several conflicts, proving himself a capable military commander who achieved victories through careful planning and overwhelming force rather than through reckless heroism or desperate gambles. Tywin resolved disputes between great houses before they could escalate into open warfare, maintained order throughout the realm with an efficiency that made his tenure as Hand remembered as one of the most stable and prosperous periods in living memory, and generally demonstrated a level of administrative competence that made him seem indispensable to the functioning of the kingdom. Yet despite this success, perhaps because of it, his relationship with King Aerys eventually deteriorated as the king's mental state declined and his paranoia grew. The Mad King began to resent his too capable Hand, seeing threats in Tywin's competence and imagining that his servant might harbor ambitions to replace him. The slights and insults accumulated over time until Tywin could no longer ignore them without appearing weak, and he finally resigned his position as Hand and returned to Casterly Rock, but his reputation as perhaps the most capable administrator and political mind in the realm remained firmly established and enhanced by his long tenure. Tywin's personality was marked above all else by absolute control, by cold calculation that seemed to operate without the interference of emotion, and by unwavering commitment to family legacy as the organizing principle of his entire life. He felt emotions as deeply as any man, experiencing the full range of human feelings from love to rage to grief, but he maintained at all times a carefully constructed facade of perfect composure. never allowing others to see weakness or uncertainty or the turmoil that might exist beneath the surface. He demanded excellence from everyone around him, setting standards that many found impossible to meet, and showing no tolerance for failure or weakness or excuses for inadequate performance. His expectations for his own children were immense and arguably crushing, as he saw them not as individuals with their own desires and dreams, but as extensions of the family legacy, tools to be deployed in service of House Lannister's interests, continuations of the family line, whose personal happiness or fulfillment were always secondary considerations at best. This approach to his children created complicated and often painful relationships, particularly with his youngest son, but Tywin never wavered in his conviction that family came first. That personal happiness was a luxury that those born to great houses could not necessarily afford. That duty to the family name and legacy superseded any individual's preferences or desires. His entire worldview was organized around the principle that what mattered was the strength and reputation of House Lannister, that all other considerations were subordinate to this central concern, and that he would do whatever proved necessary to ensure that the family he passed on to the next generation was stronger and more respected than the family he had inherited from his inadequate father. The wealth of House Lannister reached unprecedented heights during Tywin's long tenure as Lord of Casterly Rock, expanding beyond even the already legendary levels that had characterized the house throughout its history. The gold mines produced more precious metal than ever before, through improved techniques of extraction and ore processing that Tywin actively encouraged and funded, through expanded operations that opened new shafts and followed veins deeper into the earth than previous generations had dared to go, and through systematic approaches to mining that emphasized efficiency and sustainable production rather than rapid exploitation that might exhaust deposits prematurely. Trade through Lannisport flourished as Tywin ensured security along the trade routes and fair dealing in the markets, creating conditions that attracted merchants from the most distant lands and encouraged ever-expanding volumes of commerce that enriched both the merchants themselves and the Lannisters, who collected taxes and fees on all these profitable transactions. The crown's debts to Casterly Rock grew to truly staggering levels as Tywin lent freely to the Iron Throne, always carefully documenting terms and ensuring that obligations were clearly understood, even if immediate repayment was not demanded. By the time of his death, House Lannister had become so wealthy that the phrase "rich as a Lannister" had entered common speech across the entire realm, a saying that everyone understood and that captured the sense that Lannister wealth had transcended normal measures and entered the realm of legend, that trying to count or comprehend the full extent of what the family possessed was futile, because the amounts involved exceeded normal human capacity for understanding vast numbers. Tywin understood that wealth required protection through military strength, that gold sitting in vaults could be taken by anyone strong enough to break down the walls, that economic power without the backing of credible military force was ultimately vulnerable to those willing to use violence. He maintained the largest and best-equipped military force of any great house, rivaling, and perhaps exceeding in quality, the armies the crown itself could muster when it called its banners. The Lannister soldiers were well paid by the standards of their profession, receiving wages high enough to attract capable men and to ensure loyalty through practical self-interest, rather than relying solely on feudal obligation or abstract concepts of honor. They were well trained through constant drills and exercises that maintained their skills even during long periods of peace. They were well supplied with arms and armor of the finest quality that Lannister gold could purchase, giving them material advantages in any conflict that would tilt the odds in their favor before the first sword was even swung. These military forces served both defensive and offensive purposes, protecting the Westerlands from any external threat that might arise, while also being available to project Lannister power wherever it might be needed, to protect family interests, or to support positions that Tywin deemed important. The very existence of such a formidable military force deterred potential aggression from rivals who might otherwise be tempted to test Lannister strength, and it gave enormous weight to Lannister positions in political disputes, where the implicit threat of overwhelming force, backed by unlimited financial resources, made resistance seem futile and accommodation seem wise. The political philosophy that Tywin embodied and consciously taught to those around him represented the culmination and refinement of centuries of Lannister thinking about the nature of power and the methods by which it must be gained, maintained, and deployed. He believed with absolute conviction that power derived ultimately from fear and respect, rather than from love or affection, that pragmatism must always triumph over sentiment. When the two came into conflict, that ends justified means when the survival and advancement of House Lannister were at stake, and that weakness or mercy shown at the wrong moment could prove far more cruel in its ultimate consequences than hardness applied preemptively to prevent worse outcomes. He famously observed that a lion does not concern itself with the opinions of sheep, a statement that encapsulated his entire worldview regarding the natural hierarchy of power and the futility of seeking universal approval, or worrying about what lesser beings thought of those who ruled over them. As the daylight fades gently into evening across the Westerlands, as shadows lengthen across the golden hills, and the sun descends slowly toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that echo the colors of the lion, the stone of Casterly Rock catches the light and seems to glow with an inner radiance, transforming for these brief moments from pale limestone into something that appears to be beaten gold. This daily transformation, this alchemical change that occurs reliably with each sunset, became a kind of metaphor for House Lannister itself, for the way that ordinary materials, whether stone or human ambition, could be transmuted into something precious and powerful through the application of will, intelligence, resources, and generations of patient effort, building continuously toward an ever more magnificent whole. In the gathering dusk, as stars begin to appear overhead and the rhythm of daily life slows toward the quietness of night, we can contemplate the long arc of Lannister history stretching backward through time to origins lost in legend and myth. We can trace the family's journey from those legendary beginnings through millennia of rule, through the transformation from independent kings to paramount lords serving under a united crown, through periods of strength that made the very name Lannister synonymous with power, and periods of relative decline when the family struggled to maintain what earlier generations had built. The story encompasses countless individual lives, each with their own dreams and failures and achievements, all contributing to the larger narrative of a house that endured through everything that history could bring against it. The legacy of House Lannister extends far beyond the simple facts of their wealth and power. They influenced the very way that people throughout the realm thought about the relationship between gold and political influence. They demonstrated what could be achieved through patient accumulation and strategic deployment of resources over many generations. They showed that power need not rest solely on ancient bloodlines or supernatural sanction, or even on martial prowess, though all these things had their place and their value. They proved that clear-eyed assessment of self-interest, combined with willingness to act on that assessment, could accomplish things that more traditional or more sentimental approaches could never achieve. Yet the Lannister story also serves as a kind of warning or caution to those who would seek to emulate their success. Power built primarily on wealth and fear faces particular challenges when wealth diminishes or when fear proves insufficient to compel obedience. Relationships based purely on calculation may prove brittle when genuine loyalty and authentic human connection become necessary. Pride that prevents acknowledgement of error or learning from others creates a kind of blindness that can prove fatal when circumstances change in unexpected ways. The Lannisters at their very best understood these dangers and worked to navigate around them. But at their worst, they fell into the very traps that their sophisticated philosophy should have helped them avoid. The physical remains of Lannister power will outlast all the individuals who built and maintained that power over the centuries. The mines continue to produce gold that will be extracted and refined and spent long after every Lannister living today has passed into history and been forgotten, except perhaps his names in dusty records. Casterly Rock will likely stand for thousands of years more, its massive bulk of stone impervious to time and weather, hosting whatever lords and families come after to claim dominion over the Westerlands, bearing witness to the continuing flow of history, as it has borne witness already to countless generations of human ambition and achievement and failure. The memory of House Lannister will persist in songs and stories told in taverns and great halls, in historical chronicles maintained by maesters who record everything that seemed significant, in the very language of the realm where phrases like a Lannister always pays his debts will echo long after the specific context that gave rise to such sayings has been forgotten. The Golden Lion will remain a symbol instantly recognized throughout the realm and beyond, associated forever with wealth, pride, power, and that particular combination of pragmatism and ruthless ambition that characterized this remarkable family at the height of their achievement. In the deep stillness of this moment, as we reach the end of our long journey through the corridors and vaults of Lannister history, we might reflect quietly on the nature of legacy itself, and what it means to try to build something intended to last beyond a single human lifetime. What drives individuals to sacrifice their own happiness for the advancement of a family name that will continue after they are gone? What transforms ordinary human ambition into the extraordinary multi-generational achievements represented by great houses like the Lannisters? What does it cost in human terms to maintain such relentless focus on power and wealth across so many lifetimes? These questions have no simple answers that can be stated in a single sentence, but the long story of House Lannister illuminates them from many angles and provides material for contemplation and understanding that would not be possible from examining any single life or any single generation in isolation. The Westerlands rest now beneath their ancient blanket of stars, the same stars that have watched over these lands since before humans first came to settle these shores and to dig into these hills, seeking the gold that would shape so much of subsequent history. The mines lie mostly quiet in the depths of night, though some shafts never fully cease their operations, and so even now in darkness, there are men working far below the surface, following veins of precious metal by the light of lamps that create tiny bubbles of illumination in the vast darkness of the earth. Casterly Rock stands as it has always stood, eternal and immovable, its stones still holding warmth absorbed from the day's sunlight and gradually releasing that warmth into the cooling air of evening. Its halls and chambers housing generations of accumulated treasures and memories, and the sleeping forms of those who currently bear the weight of the Lannister name. And somewhere in those vast chambers, perhaps in dreams, the current lords and ladies of House Lannister rest, golden and proud, dreaming perhaps of past glories achieved by their ancestors, and future triumphs that they hope to achieve in their own lifetimes, of wealth that already seems beyond measure, but that might yet be increased, of power that already dominates the realm, but that might be expanded further still. The Lions of Lannister have prowled through history for thousands of years, and their story continues forward into an unknowable future, even as we look backward to understand the long path that brought them to this present moment. The sea continues its eternal conversation with the shore far below Casterly Rock, waves speaking in rhythms older than human memory, older than human presence on these shores, rhythms that will continue unchanged, long after the last Lannister has passed into dust and the last stone of Casterly Rock has finally crumbled under the patient assault of wind and water and time. The sound of those waves, barely audible in the upper chambers of the rock, but growing louder as one descends toward sea level, provides a kind of constant music, a reminder that some things persist regardless of human ambition or achievement, that the world itself continues its ancient patterns while human dynasties rise and fall across the surface of things. Let us rest now with these thoughts, these images of gold and stone, of pride and power, of ambition spanning centuries and wealth accumulating across generations. Let the story of House Lannister carry you gently into sleep on the weight of all those accumulated years, on the cold gleam of gold piled in deep vaults, on the warm strength of stone that has stood since before memory and will stand long after memory fades. The Golden Lions rest in their mountain fortress, secure in their power, confident in their legacy, eternal as the stone from which they rule. The Lannister understanding of power, refined across so many generations and tested against so many challenges, recognized certain fundamental truths that govern the way the family approached every situation and made every significant decision. They understood that power is not a fixed substance that one either possesses or lacks, but rather a dynamic relationship that must be constantly maintained and renewed through active effort and continuous demonstration. They understood that perception often matters as much as reality, that appearing powerful can make one powerful by changing how others behave in response to that appearance. They understood that flexibility and adaptation to changing circumstances matter more than rigid adherence to principles, that survival across centuries requires the ability to change tactics while maintaining core identity and purpose. These insights guided Lannister behavior through countless crises and opportunities, allowing the family to navigate situations that destroyed other houses lacking similar understanding or similar resources to deploy based on that understanding. When other houses clung to outdated strategies because tradition demanded it, or because changing course would seem like weakness, the Lannisters adapted smoothly to new realities, accepting short-term embarrassment or tactical retreat when necessary to preserve long-term position. When other houses squandered resources on gestures meant to satisfy honor or maintain appearances that no longer served practical purposes, the Lannisters directed their wealth toward investments that would generate returns and enhance their actual capabilities. The relationship between House Lannister and the broader concept of Westerosi nobility, the system of hereditary aristocracy that governed the entire continent, was complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, the Lannisters were the ultimate exemplars of successful nobility, proving that the system could produce exceptional families that maintained their positions across immense spans of time. Their wealth, their culture, their whole way of being represented the aristocratic ideal taken to its highest expression, showing what noble families could achieve when everything worked according to the theory of hereditary superiority. On the other hand, the Lannister approach to power often violated or undermined the values that nobility supposedly represented. The emphasis on wealth rather than honor, on calculation rather than courage, on pragmatism rather than principle, on flexibility rather than consistency. All these aspects of Lannister philosophy contradicted the idealized version of nobility that bards sang about and that maesters taught to young lords studying history and ethics. The Lannisters succeeded precisely by not fully buying into the mythology of noble virtue, by recognizing that the reality of power often required actions that romantic notions of nobility would condemn. This tension between being supremely successful nobles while simultaneously undermining the values of nobility created interesting dynamics in how other houses related to the Lannisters. They were simultaneously admired as exemplars of what great houses could achieve and resented as corrupting influences that made genuine nobility seem naive or outdated. They were held up as models of success while also being cited as examples of what happened when families lost sight of what truly mattered beyond mere accumulation of wealth and power. The architectural style favored by the Lannisters across their centuries of rule evolved and changed with shifting tastes and technologies, but certain consistent themes appeared again and again, regardless of the specific period or individual lord making decisions about construction and decoration. There was always an emphasis on grandeur and scale, on creating spaces that impressed through sheer size and ambition as much as through refined detail. There was consistent use of the finest materials available, with common stone replaced by marble, with wood giving way to precious metals for decorative elements, with everything chosen to demonstrate that cost was no obstacle and that only the best was acceptable for spaces associated with House Lannister. The symbolism woven into Lannister architecture and decoration was equally consistent across the centuries. Lions appeared everywhere in sculpture and painting and carving, from massive statues flanking doorways to small details in the designs of floor tiles. Gold was incorporated wherever possible, not merely as decoration, but as a fundamental element of the visual language, creating spaces where visitors were constantly reminded of the wealth that made such displays possible. Light was carefully controlled through the placement and design of windows, creating dramatic effects that enhanced the emotional impact of entering Lannister spaces and that demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of architectural principles that wealth could purchase. The evolution of defensive architecture at Casterly Rock reflected changing military technologies and strategies across the long centuries of Lannister rule. The oldest defensive works, dating back to the age when the Casterlys first carved their fortress from the living rock, were relatively simple, relying primarily on the natural strength of the stone itself and on the height and steepness of the cliff faces that made conventional assault nearly impossible. As siege technologies developed and armies became more sophisticated, successive generations of Lannisters added layers of defensive features, creating systems of walls, gates, towers, and fortified approaches that turned the natural strength of the rock into a military position that seemed absolutely impregnable to any force that could realistically be assembled against it. Yet even as they made the rock stronger against conventional siege and assault, the Lannisters also recognized that the nature of threats was changing, that in an age where political assassination and internal betrayal might prove more dangerous than external armies, security required attention to less obvious vulnerabilities. Secret passages were sealed or guarded. Systems for testing food and drink for poison were implemented. Loyal guards were positioned at crucial points throughout the complex. Intelligence networks were developed to identify potential threats before they could materialize into actual attempts against the family. The security of Casterly Rock thus became as much about information and vigilance as about walls and weapons. The daily rhythms of life within Casterly Rock during periods of peace reflected the enormous household necessary to maintain such a vast complex and to support the activities of one of the great houses of the realm. Hundreds of servants worked constantly to maintain the halls, chambers, and public spaces, cleaning and repairing, and ensuring that everything met the exacting standards that the Lannisters demanded. Cooks and kitchen staff prepared meals for the family and guests, and for the soldiers and servants who all needed feeding. Grooms cared for the hundreds of horses stabled within the rock or in facilities near its base. Armories employed craftsmen who maintained and repaired weapons and armor. Treasurers and their assistants managed the flow of gold in and out of the vaults, keeping meticulous records of every transaction. The maesters serving House Lannister formed their own small community within the larger household, providing essential services that ranged from medical care to education to communication with distant correspondents. The senior maester, who advised the Lord of Casterly Rock, held a position of considerable responsibility and influence, though always understood to be a servant rather than a true counselor in the way that close family members or lifelong friends might be. Younger maesters handled more routine tasks, sending and receiving ravens, maintaining the libraries, teaching young members of the family, and generally making themselves useful in whatever ways their training and the needs of the household required. The spiritual life of Casterly Rock centered on the magnificent sept carved into the mountain, but religious observance among the Lannisters themselves varied considerably depending on individual inclination and the particular period of history in question. Some lords and ladies were genuinely pious, attending regular services and taking seriously the moral teachings of the faith of the Seven. Others were more perfunctory in their religious duties, going through the motions expected of great lords, but without deep personal conviction or commitment. The family as a whole understood the political importance of maintaining good relations with the faith and of being seen as properly respectful of religious institutions. But they never allowed religious considerations to override their assessment of where their practical interests lay. The seasonal festivals celebrated throughout the Westerlands provided occasions for the Lannisters to display their wealth and generosity, while also reinforcing social bonds between the great house and their vassals, and between all levels of society within the region. The harvest festivals of autumn brought lords and knights to Casterly Rock for tournaments and feasts that lasted days and featured displays of Lannister magnificence that left visitors overwhelmed, and provided occasions for settling disputes and arranging marriages and conducting all the business that needed doing when weather allowed people to travel freely again. These gatherings served multiple purposes simultaneously, combining genuine celebration and enjoyment with political theater and relationship management. Young people met potential marriage partners under circumstances that allowed both sides to assess compatibility and advantages. Lords with grievances could present them formally and expect serious attention, rather than being ignored or dismissed. Military capability was displayed through tournaments that doubled as recruitment opportunities and assessments of relative strength. News was shared and rumors circulated, creating flows of information that the Lannisters both participated in and carefully monitored to understand what people were thinking and saying. The education system for young Lannisters, and for the children of important vassals who were sometimes fostered at Casterly Rock, involved carefully structured programs designed to produce capable adults who understood their roles and responsibilities. Formal instruction in reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and other academic subjects occupied mornings under the supervision of maesters who demanded high standards and punished laziness or inattention. Afternoons were devoted to physical training for boys, including weapons practice, riding, hunting, and other martial skills considered essential for any nobleman. Girls received instruction in music, embroidery, dancing, and other accomplishments expected of high-born ladies, though the cleverest girls sometimes received more substantive education when their natural abilities became apparent and when they had parents or guardians willing to support broader learning. Beyond formal instruction, young people learned through observation and participation in the daily life of Casterly Rock, absorbing lessons about power and politics and human nature that could not be taught directly through lectures or books. They watched how their elders handled disputes and negotiations. They observed the delicate dance of status and precedence that governed every interaction in formal settings. They learned to read the unspoken messages conveyed through gesture and tone and facial expression. They developed the complex social skills necessary to navigate the dangerous world of high-level politics, where a single misjudgment could have terrible consequences. The Lannister approach to marriage within the family involved careful planning that balanced several competing considerations. They needed to arrange marriages that served political purposes, creating or strengthening alliances with other houses. They needed to avoid excessive inbreeding that might weaken the family bloodline and produce unhealthy or incompetent heirs, a danger the Targaryens illustrated all too clearly with their practice of brother-sister marriages that eventually contributed to madness and physical weakness. They needed to maintain the distinctive Lannister appearance and character traits across generations, while also introducing enough fresh blood to keep the family vigorous. And they needed to navigate all these considerations while also responding to immediate political situations that might make particular marriages attractive or necessary, regardless of genetic considerations. The results of this careful marriage planning varied across the centuries. Sometimes the Lannisters achieved brilliant matches that accomplished all their goals simultaneously, producing political advantages while also bringing capable and healthy individuals into the family. Other times they were forced by circumstances to accept less than ideal marriages, making the best of situations where limited options constrained their choices. And occasionally marriages that seemed perfect on paper proved disastrous in reality when the individuals involved turned out to be incompatible, or when political circumstances changed and made former allies into enemies. The economic philosophy that guided Lannister management of their wealth evolved over time as the family learned from experience and as broader economic conditions in the realm changed. In early periods, the focus was primarily on simple accumulation, on extracting as much gold from the mines as possible, and storing it in vaults against future need. Over time, the Lannisters developed more sophisticated approaches that emphasized productive deployment of capital, using their wealth to generate additional wealth through loans, investments, and strategic economic interventions that shaped broader patterns of trade and production throughout the realm. This evolution toward more active financial management made the Lannisters not merely wealthy, but also financially sophisticated in ways that gave them advantages beyond simple possession of gold. They understood concepts like compound interest and leverage and risk management that most lords of their era grasped only dimly, if at all. They could structure complex financial arrangements that served their interests, while also appearing generous or reasonable to counterparties who lacked the expertise to recognize how the terms favored the Lannisters. They could deploy their wealth in coordinated campaigns that achieved political goals indirectly through economic pressure, rather than requiring direct military or political confrontation. The Lannister intelligence apparatus, developed over centuries and reaching particular sophistication under Tywin's leadership, represented another dimension of power that operated largely invisibly, but that contributed enormously to the family's ability to maintain their position. Spies and informants throughout the realm sent regular reports on political developments, military preparations, personal scandals, and economic conditions, creating streams of information that allowed the Lannisters to understand situations more completely than rivals who lacked similar intelligence capabilities. This information advantage translated into better decisions made with better timing, into opportunities seized before others even recognized they existed, and into threats identified and neutralized before they could mature into genuine dangers. The methods used to gather this intelligence ranged from the simple to the sophisticated. Servants in other great houses could be bribed or threatened into reporting what they saw and heard. Merchants traveling widely gathered information as a natural byproduct of their business activities and could be encouraged to share it for gold or favors. Maesters could sometimes be convinced that loyalty to knowledge and learning superseded loyalty to individual houses. Prostitutes and tavern keepers heard things that people said when guard was down and wine flowed freely. These and dozens of other methods combined to create a web of information gathering that fed a constant stream of reports back to Casterly Rock. The processing and analysis of this information required its own infrastructure of literate and intelligent administrators who could separate valuable intelligence from meaningless gossip, who could identify patterns in seemingly unrelated reports, and who could present distilled summaries to the Lord of Casterly Rock in forms that supported decision-making without overwhelming with excessive detail. The value of this entire system was difficult to measure directly, but showed itself repeatedly in situations where the Lannisters seemed to possess uncanny foreknowledge or to make decisions that proved brilliantly timed, even though the basis for those decisions was not apparent to outside observers. The military forces maintained by House Lannister consisted of multiple components that served different purposes, and that together created a flexible instrument capable of responding to various types of threats and opportunities. The household guard at Casterly Rock provided security for the fortress and its inhabitants, while also serving as an elite force available for special missions that required trustworthy soldiers of proven capability. Larger bodies of men-at-arms could be assembled from lands directly controlled by the Lannisters, soldiers who owed direct service to Casterly Rock rather than being mediated through vassal houses. The feudal levies from vassal houses provided additional numbers when large forces were needed for major campaigns, though these levies varied in quality and reliability depending on which specific houses provided them. Beyond these conventional military forces, the Lannisters also employed mercenaries when circumstances warranted, hiring companies of professional soldiers who fought for pay rather than for feudal obligation or personal loyalty. While mercenaries had obvious disadvantages in terms of reliability and cost, they also offered advantages that made them valuable additions to Lannister military capabilities. They could be hired quickly when needed, rather than requiring the time necessary to call feudal levies. They could be dismissed when no longer needed, rather than having to be maintained continuously. They brought specialized skills and experience that might not exist within the regular Lannister forces. And their use allowed the Lannisters to project power without depleting their own population of fighting men or straining relationships with vassals by keeping them away from their own lands for extended periods. The relationship between the Lannisters and other powerful institutions within the realm beyond the crown itself shaped many aspects of how the family operated and what they could accomplish. The Faith of the Seven represented one such institution, wielding moral authority and popular influence that no secular lord could simply ignore. The Lannisters maintained generally good relations with the faith through generous donations, construction of magnificent religious buildings, and public displays of piety, while privately ensuring that religious considerations never constrained their freedom of action in matters they deemed crucial to family interests. The Citadel, where maesters were trained, and from which they were sent to serve the houses of the realm, represented another institution that wielded considerable, though subtle, influence. The Lannisters cultivated relationships with senior figures at the Citadel, providing funding for certain kinds of research and study, while also working to ensure that maesters sent to serve at Casterly Rock were men whose personalities and priorities made them easy to work with, rather than men who might prove difficult or who might put loyalty to the Citadel above service to the house that hosted them. The various guilds and trading companies that dominated commerce in the major cities represented yet another set of institutions that the Lannisters needed to manage and influence. In Lannisport particularly, the Lannisters worked to maintain good relations with the merchant guilds, while also ensuring that those guilds never became powerful enough to constrain Lannister freedom of action or to challenge Lannister dominance within the city. This required delicate balance between supporting guild prosperity, which enriched the entire city and increased tax revenues, and preventing guild independence that might make them difficult to control. The psychological warfare that the Lannisters waged through their reputation and through carefully cultivated image represented another dimension of their power that worked continuously to support their position. The image of Lannister wealth as essentially limitless, promoted through displays of magnificence and through stories that might be exaggerated, but that served Lannister interests by making their resources seem even more overwhelming than they actually were, discouraged potential rivals from challenging them directly. The reputation for ruthless response to any slight or challenge, maintained through occasional dramatic demonstrations that left no doubt about Lannister willingness to use extreme violence when they deemed it necessary, made most people think very carefully before crossing the family in any way. The image of Lannister intelligence and sophisticated political understanding, cultivated through the family's long record of successful navigation of complex political situations, made others reluctant to try to outmaneuver them because success seemed so unlikely. These and other aspects of carefully managed reputation created an environment where much of what the Lannisters wanted happened without their needing to take direct action, simply because others anticipated Lannister preferences and adjusted their own behavior accordingly, either to curry favor or to avoid the negative consequences of opposition. As darkness deepens across the Westerlands and the last light fades from the western sky, as the stars wheel slowly overhead in their eternal dance, and the moon rises to cast silver light across sleeping hills and quiet valleys, Casterly Rock stands in magnificent solitude, a monument to power and wealth and ambition that has endured across ages. Within its countless chambers, in beds soft with fine linens and blankets woven from the finest wool, the current generation of Lannisters sleeps, golden hair spread across silk pillows, faces relaxed in the peace that comes from absolute security and confidence in one's position. The guards who patrol the walls and corridors of the rock move quietly through the night, careful not to disturb those who rest, vigilant against threats that may never come, but that must be watched for nevertheless. The servants who maintain the vast complex during daylight hours have mostly retired to their own quarters, though some few continue working through the night at tasks that cannot wait for morning. The fires that warm the great halls bank down to glowing embers that will be stirred to life again when dawn comes. The lamps that light the main passages burn low but steadily, providing enough illumination that anyone moving through the rock at night need not stumble in complete darkness. Far below, in the deepest mines, work continues as it always continues, men extracting gold from the living rock by the light of torches and lamps, following veins of precious metal deeper into the earth, adding to the accumulated wealth that defines and sustains House Lannister. The rhythm of picks striking stone echoes through the passages, a steady percussion that has continued for thousands of years, and that will continue for thousands more as long as gold remains in the depths to be found and extracted. The miners know nothing of the politics and grand strategies that occupy the thoughts of lords in the halls far above them. They know only the immediate reality of hard labor in difficult conditions, the promise of wages that make the work worthwhile, and the distant hope that faithful service might lead to better opportunities for themselves or their children. The sea continues its ancient conversation with the shore, waves rising and falling with the tides, the sound carrying up the cliff face to reach even the highest chambers of Casterly Rock, a constant presence that becomes so familiar to those who live there. They notice it only when it changes in intensity during great storms, or when they leave and find themselves in places where that sound is absent. This sound, this endless rhythm of water meeting stone, reminds us that some things persist regardless of human concerns, that the world itself continues its patterns while human dramas of power and wealth and ambition play out across surfaces that seem so important to those involved, but that barely register in the larger scales of geology and deep time. Let us leave the Lannisters now to their well-earned rest in their impregnable fortress, secure in their wealth and confident in their power, dreaming perhaps of golden futures that will mirror their golden past. Let us draw back slowly from the particular and individual, rising up to see the broader patterns, the long arcs that span not years, but centuries, the great sweeps of history within which individual lives become small moments in much larger narratives. From this perspective, we can see House Lannister as a phenomenon that has persisted across an enormous span of time, adapting and evolving while maintaining core identity, surviving challenges that destroyed other houses, building continuously on foundations laid by ancestors long dead and nearly forgotten. The story of the Golden Lions continues beyond this telling, moving forward into futures we cannot see, facing challenges we cannot anticipate, making choices whose consequences will unfold across generations yet unborn. But we have traced their path from legendary origins through thousands of years to arrive at this present moment. And in that long journey, we have seen patterns that illuminate not merely this one family, but larger truths about power and wealth and human ambition, about what endures and what fades, about the costs of maintaining position across centuries and the rewards that come to those who succeed in that difficult endeavor. Rest now with these thoughts, these images of golden lions and impregnable stones, of wealth beyond measure and power beyond challenge, of pride that seems like arrogance but that rests on genuine achievement, of ruthlessness that shocks but that proves effective, of cold calculation that seems heartless but that preserves what warmer approaches might lose. Let the accumulated weight of centuries press gently down like heavy blankets, warm and secure, wrapping around you as the story of House Lannister has wrapped around you across this long telling. The lions rest in their mountain halls, golden and eternal, as certain of their position as the stone beneath their feet, as confident in their destiny as their ancestors were across all the long generations that stretch backward into the mists of legend and myth. They have earned their rest through the labors of building and maintaining power across impossible expanses of time. They sleep secure in knowledge that the wealth remains, the fortress stands, the name endures, the legacy continues. And we too can rest now, our journey through their history complete, our understanding enriched, our minds full of golden images and crimson dreams, ready for the gentle sleep that follows such contemplation of power and permanence, wealth and will, pride and achievement, measured not in years, but in millennia. Sleep well, knowing that some things endure, that some families build legacies that outlast empires, that wealth wisely managed and power carefully deployed can create dynasties that seem eternal. Sleep wrapped in images of gold and stone, of lions both proud and deadly, of fortresses that cannot fall and wealth that cannot be exhausted. Sleep to the sound of distant waves and the whisper of ancient stones settling into themselves. Sleep to dreams of power and glory. Sleep secure and safe in the knowledge that the story has been told, the history recounted, the legacy acknowledged and understood. The golden lions of Casterly Rock watch over their domain through the quiet hours of night, eternal guardians of the West, and we can rest beneath their watchful gaze, secure in our contemplation of all they have achieved and all they represent in the long annals of power. As the Starks say, winter is coming. You rest now, and tomorrow you wake again, ready for the toils of the day. But now you sleep. Sleep the night away.